I've been writing and thinking about this stuff and talking to people about it for a decade now, as you know. And I've talked to a lot of marine biologists over the years. Um, and I sort of try to process what they've told me and regurgitate it back out. And I've said things to you, and you're like, well, is that your theory, or is that just what other people think too? And I'm like, you know what? I need to hear it from the actual experts. And one of the first people I wanted to reach out to get up to date on the status of some of these marine pieces that we've been talking about is Jim Carlton, who is a professor emeritus at Williams College. He is known as probably the leading marine invertebrate expert in the world. Invertebrates being soft-shelled animals like Lepas barnacles, like a lot of the things that were found growing on pieces of debris, like the flaperon and the other objects that we've been talking about. I reached out to Jim, and I kind of brought myself up to speed with all of these pieces. And you know, Andy, something we say a lot in this podcast is like the closer you look at the evidence, the stranger it gets. And what we're going to talk about today is just a perfect example of that. We're going to talk about some MH370 evidence that's very well known around the world, but few people have looked at it in the kind of detail that really reveals the richness and the strangeness of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk to Jim. I talked to him earlier, and I made a video, and we're going to sort of, you and I are going to talk about my conversation with him, so you
Right.
can kind of set it up and contextualize it.
The thing that I can't wrap my head around, and you're right, it's because you eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff, and
Right.
I'm fairly new to it, and there's so much information. This debris stuff is super important in the overall story, but when I see pieces of debris that sometimes have barnacles on them, they sometimes don't have barnacles on them, and I want to just sort of follow your logic, but then I
Right.
wonder, like, well, could they have like floated back into the water and gotten washed off? Or
Right.
could when we talk about how as soon as they're dead, they get eaten by other marine life, is that
Right.
sort of like, and you're going to get into more detail about this, but is that
I think,
making all of this stuff not really make the sense that it's supposed to make?
okay, it's a really important question because this is the basis on which a lot of our understanding of what happened to the plane is going to rest on. And so let me just kind of just do a quick run through of how
Okay.
it works.
Okay.
And you're going to hear, we're going to be talking about this kind of over and over again, because we're going to have to, we're kind of just going to lay layer upon layer of evidence. We're going to talk to a lot of marine biologists who are going to be telling us their version, and they're going to be telling slightly different versions. And so it's great that we all have the same foundation. And so this is how it works. You start with a piece that hasn't been in the ocean before. It could be a piece of an airplane that's crashed into the ocean. It could be like a drinks cooler that fell off a boat. It could be an oar that somebody dropped off the rowboat. Anything at all falls into the ocean and it starts to float. And there's little critters that live in the water that their lifestyle involves attaching themselves to what's called a substrate, something hard.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be that hard. It could be a floating piece of seaweed even, but it attaches to something, and its lifestyle involves being attached to that thing. And essentially, it will then spend as much time as the good Lord gives it to float around, and it's pulling other things out of the water and eating it. It will grow bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually, it will reproduce. And if it is an organism that has evolved to live in the open ocean, like Lepas anatifera, the gooseneck barnacle that we're spending a lot of time talking about, if it gets onto the shore, it will not be happy and it will die. Basically, if these things wash ashore, they will get eaten by things like crabs and seagulls. And what will happen is a piece that has been colonized by this creature and its brethren, because when you're in the ocean, if you're a critter living in the ocean that attaches to things, it's very valuable real estate to have a thing to attach to. So anything that spends any amount of time in the ocean, boaters will know this, especially people who have boats in the ocean.
Yeah.
You'll get all kinds of gunk growing on the bottom of your boat. And so what we have is, if you take 100 objects and throw them in the water, you will see them all accumulating organisms. And these organisms, it's almost like the ecological succession in a forest that you've probably learned about in school, where it's like you get grass, and then you get little bushes, and then you get trees, and then you wind up eventually with oak trees, but that takes a really long time. So in the same way with stuff that floats in the ocean, you'll get little fuzz and brown stuff and and slimy stuff. And eventually you'll get these magnificent, long, droopy Lepas
Yeah.
barnacles. So you see the forest growing on this piece, then it washes ashore, and then it gets stripped. And so if a piece has been in the water for 5 months, it comes ashore with a big, healthy population that gets eaten. That piece is now bumping around in the intertidal zone. It's getting scraped and bumped on rocks and things. It might wash above the high water mark for a while, and then a storm will come or a rainstorm will wash it out to sea. It might float around for a little bit longer. It might acquire a second population and then wash ashore again. And
Okay.
so, does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to like oversimplify this,
Sure.
but to me, the part that has been confusing is when I don't see barnacles on pieces. But in actuality, I think what you're saying is not seeing barnacles is less notable than actually seeing barnacles, right? If they're gone, that means that they were on land or that they were eaten. But if you do see barnacles, it means that something over time occurred to make them grow and be there.
There's typically two ways that an object doesn't have barnacles on it. The first one is that it just got into the water,
Right.
and the second one is that it had the barnacles and they got eaten off after it came ashore on land. Now, there's a third possibility that is conceptually possible, which is that something like while it was floating around ate it. And I've heard sort of anecdotally stories about turtles eating these things, fish eating these things. There's certain kinds of other invertebrates called nudibranchs that eat them. And so it's conceptually possible for these things to get stripped at sea, but viewers and listeners will hear in the weeks to come from marine biologists who will tell us that that actually doesn't really happen too much. Typically, if you see a piece that has 5 months worth of growth on it, it's been at sea for 5 months.
Okay.
It didn't spend a year at sea and get stripped halfway through. And that's a
Okay.
very important distinction to make.
Okay. All right. That's good enough for me for now.
Okay.
I may have more questions later.
But listen, it's a thing we can keep coming back to. Something seems strange or odd. Here's the complicating factor, Andy. This is strange and odd stuff. These we're going to find out that this debris that gets collected doesn't seem to have behaved in the way that pieces should have behaved. So we're going to definitely need to pause. If listeners or viewers want to, ask questions in the comments here or at the show page, fire away.
All right. Last time we talked about the flaperon and the 4 other pieces that were found after it. We talked about how the Australian authorities, they just struggled to make sense of all this stuff. Like how did it float from the 7th arc and then get to La Réunion in the time that it did? And they made models to like basically support their theory, which I'm not a scientist, but I think that's not really how you do it. I think you make you make the models, then you look at the evidence as opposed to try to make it fit in. But that's neither.
Well, there was confusion. I mean, there was confusion from the get-go because from right away when the French collected the flaperon on La Réunion and took it back to Toulouse and examined it, they found a contradiction.
Right.
Which is that this barnacle was completely covered in barnacles, which they said entre deux eaux.
Yes.
Which is how we started to speak French like crazy Parisians. And yet, when they put it in the tank, it floated high and dry. And so I want to get into that actually a little bit more right now. I want to, because I really want to clarify and make sure everyone is exactly on the same page with this, why this is so weird. Lepas barnacles attach themselves to floating objects. We know that.
Yes.
And they attach themselves to the underwater part. And we're going to put some pictures up on the screen. We'll have it on the show page as well. We're going to see how they float. The part that's above the water doesn't have Lepas on it. The piece that's underwater has Lepas on it, is attached to it, because they get they breathe and they get their food from the water. Not hard to understand. Now, as we were saying, when the flaperon washed ashore, the authorities couldn't figure out where the water line was because it was covered all over, including on the trailing edge. Now, I want to direct people's attention particularly, and this is where I'm sorry, audio only listeners, I'm going to have to sort of describe it to you. The part of the flaperon that is furthest from the front of the wing, the backmost part of it got ripped off, but the part of the trailing edge that remained was fully covered in barnacles. And we have a picture of the entire flaperon
Yep.
and with this sort of rearmost part facing us. I've circled part of it in green and part of it in blue. And if you zoom in, you see that there's quite healthy, dense populations of Lepas attached here in both of these places. Now, what did the French see when they took it to Toulouse? Well, they put it in a tank, and they ultimately wound up publishing some images. And as you can see, they found that it floated either upside down or right side up. And it wasn't that hard to flip. It was a relatively wavy condition would easily flip it back and forth. But no matter which way it floated, the trailing edge was out of the water. It was high and dry. And when the Australians did the same thing with this, remember this spare flaperon that the Americans gave them, and they cut it down so that it resembled the one found on La Réunion. They floated the same way, and they ultimately published pictures of it, so you can see with your own eyes this thing floating with the trailing edge sticking high and dry out of the water. Okay, so how do we reconcile this information? And so this is, I would argue, a core mystery of the MH370 disappearance, because what we know is that when this piece washed ashore on La Réunion, it had a fresh population of barnacles that had been in the water. Now we're getting into a separate question, but how do you know how old a Lepas is? You can study populations, and there's various papers that we'll be referring to, and we'll be talking to more experts about this. But you can get a rough idea of how old they are by how big they are. And based on how big these ones were, they were probably anywhere between 1 month and 6 months old. That's kind of the extreme range that I've been cited.
Can we just tell people why this matters? I mean, in case it's not super duper obvious by now.
Okay, so we have a piece that comes to La Réunion. It has clearly been, the trailing edge has been submerged for the last, say, 4 months. And yet, if you put it in the water, these pieces will stick up out. How do you reconcile the fact that on the one hand, it seems to have been floating totally submerged, and on the other hand, it doesn't want to float submerged? Something must have been holding it down.
Yeah.
And so this isn't just me saying it. We're going to talk to the world's leading expert on marine invertebrates. Now, Jim, one of the major things he did with his career was study this population of debris that was washed ashore from Japan in 2011 by the great tsunami. And all this junk was washed out to shore, and in the years that followed, it washed ashore on the coast of Oregon and Washington and so forth. And by looking at them, they could see the patterns. They could see where the patches of ocean that this stuff floated through. They could see that stuff that went north gained this kind of life form, and the ones that went south gained a different kind. And so basically, Jim was able to formulate this idea of what he called bioforensics. It's like trying to deduce, by comparing it to the other pieces, you see the commonalities, you see the differences, you see how they all drifted across the ocean from Japan, but some of them took different paths. Jim Carlton, you are really one of the most renowned marine biologists in the world. You specialize in invertebrates. Is that accurate?
The invertebrates part, I don't know about the most renowned. One of the most renowned.
You have, for many years, been a professor of marine sciences at Williams College.
Yes.
In your career, you coined a term bioforensics, and I was hoping maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, bioforensics, we use that word to examine, in this case, it's widely applicable, but to examine a rafting object and look at the species on it and see if whether the species on an object can tell us both the path it took and where it came from.
Okay, so for instance, when all this stuff got dumped into the ocean in Japan, so if you have some kind of floatable terrestrial object,
Yes.
It might be like a cooler, say.
Yes.
And it floats, and it starts to float, and it's now a terrestrial thing. It's now in a marine environment.
Indeed.
And what happens to something that, okay, it never had any marine organisms on it before?
Nope.
Now it does. And what starts to happen to it as it goes?
So a lot of using the 2011 tsunami as an example, a lot of that debris the debris that either didn't get washed back ashore or that sank in Japan, a lot of that debris resided in the coastal waters of Japan long enough to acquire Japanese species. They settled on those objects, and then those objects would be engaged. They had different paths around Japan, but eventually many of them got engaged with currents that were going north and east. So as they travel across the ocean, then they gain oceanic species, not Japanese species, but
Okay.
oceanic species. When they land in North America, they have a combination of species from Japan and the species picked up en route before landing. And on some cases, but rare, if those objects resided long enough along the Pacific coast of North America, and we thought that was fairly transient before they landed, they would pick up a few American species.
I see. And one of the things we've talked about in the podcast before is that when things float, they tend to, there's kind of a broad scale tendency, called currents that take things along more or less the same route. There's kind of what we call sort of a dominant tendency. But there's also a certain kind of randomness within the current so that pieces will still follow different paths.
Yes.
And I think we talked in the past, you and I, about how when stuff got washed into the ocean in Japan, some of it wound up going on a more northerly route and some of it found a more southerly path. And so would it be accurate to say that when you look at stuff that's been floating for months or years, you see similarities but also differences, and the differences allow you to sort of discriminate sort of like a sub-story within the larger story?
I would say that as we study objects that have been at sea for years, the mysteries increase, and it's extraordinarily hard to predict some exact path, length of residency, while rafting, while drifting. But yes, the overall pattern was this stuff was from the tsunami zone. That was bioforensics. That was
Okay.
these species that we found on the debris said to us, we are from basically north of Tokyo, south of Hokkaido. It was sort of a biological fingerprint. That was a huge help. The other huge help was whenever possible, if this stuff had registration numbers, we worked with the consulate of Japan. And yes, that boat was lost on March 11, 2011 from
Right.
a particular city. Yeah.
So you're using the mix of species that you're finding, because some of them are endemic to Japan, some of them might be endemic to certain latitudes within the open Pacific,
Yep.
etc. And you're seeing these sort of patterns again and again and again. And
Yes.
each piece might have its own idiosyncrasies, but you're seeing a kind of
Yes.
general trend of species, etc. And also the growth, because there's been a lot of papers done on Lepas growth rates. They're not always consistent. They often disagree.
Yeah.
But there seems to be an overwhelming sense that we kind of can get a sense of how long these things have been in the water. When the scientists at the ATSB, which were in charge of finding this missing airplane, when they did their drift modeling, and they had pretty sophisticated drift modeling, they had sort of very time-specific wind and wave information.
Yeah.
Some of it derived from satellite and so forth, and they used drifters and etc. So they had some pretty good environmental information to plug into their models. They had a really hard time making it work. They couldn't get it to Reunion in the 15 months that they had. And so they went to the length of actually getting a real flaperon, cutting it down so that it matched the damage that had been observed.
Yeah.
Then they got it to work because of the windage. But this leads us to kind of the really kind of central and to me fascinating paradox of the flaperon, which is, I sent you some pictures
Yep.
of the Lepas that were found growing on this thing, especially on the trailing edge.
Yeah.
And the way it floated doesn't really match what you would expect, given that really healthy growth of these underwater organisms.
Yeah, it was, and that again, just for clarification, that was because there were Lepas on part of the flaperon, and that part of the flaperon would not submerge in these
Right.
tests.
Right. So when they put it in the tank, or
Yeah.
when they put the real piece in the tank, or when they put the replicate in the ocean,
Yeah.
it was sort of bistable. It would flip. It would be either right side up or upside down. and it didn't take a lot of energy to flip it, but in neither orientation was the trailing edge underwater.
Yeah. So what I wondered whether or not is that there was more to the flaperon than was seen when it washed ashore.
Right.
It looks like on the edge of the object, it's ragged. It looks like
Mm-hmm.
there are connections, and I would imagine if you take that thing off a plane, you could take other parts of the plane with it,
Right.
or however it breaks apart. And so, um, I would simply guess it was all underwater, and by the time it landed parts the parts that were holding it down, sort of
Mm.
like ballast, simply were gone, and that part expressed itself above water. So I don't think it's very much of a mystery. It seems very logical that for part of its life it was underwater.
So, and not only just for part of its life, but it would have had to be held underwater up until right before it came ashore because these organisms were alive, it seems, or at least fresh.
Yeah, I couldn't tell that. You can find an old, very dried thing on a beach with lepus that looked pretty good. We
Mm.
would have had to have on-site on-site testimony that these guys were that the stalk was fleshy and there was still tissue inside the barnacle. But
Right.
if it landed in a gentle way and they were simply being baked and mummified on a beach.
When you talk about being attached to something else, the only thing it attaches to is obviously the wing itself. The wing is also a fairly high buoyancy object, and it's not impossible to imagine the sort of flaperon being attached to the wing, and then the wing maybe banging ashore on La Reunion and getting banged off. Of course, then that kind of raises the question of what happened to the wing that it also didn't get discovered, but who knows?
Yeah, stuff sits on beaches for an awful long time and not discovered. Depends how remote the beach is,
Right.
how often it's visited. Again, I'll go back to a model that whether or not it could have come ashore somewhere for a while, then been released by another storm. How
Right.
long was it between? How many months had passed between the day of disappearance and the time it was found on Reunion?
It was 15 months, so it had to kind of go straight, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
And what's interesting about what we're talking about, it's fascinating to me that this hasn't really been discussed before because it does again change. Now we don't know anymore what the windage is because we know that this piece actually, what it seems like what you're telling me is that this piece could not have floated from the impact site in this configuration.
Um, Unless something else happened along the way to weigh it down, we can clearly go with the model that if Lepus is attached to an object, it it was underwater.
Okay.
That's not a debate. Many boats that came from Japan, they arrived upside down,
Mm-hmm.
and there's the water line. The bottom of the boat is exposed to air.
Mm-hmm.
All around the boat, there are huge Lepus colonies right exactly at the water line where the water is going up and down. But a couple inches above that, whenever the boat is dry, there are no Lepus. They will die. They'll desiccate. They have to be underwater. So
Right.
we know that. So
There's various different stories that we can tell to explain what we see. But what we can say is that this piece did not float in this configuration from the impact zone. This piece did not float like this across the Indian Ocean.
unless, as I said, um, if the moment it got the moment it was at the surface,
Mm-hmm.
um, picture day one,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. Um, there's a slight complication to that, which is we don't know if the plane was on the sea floor. We don't know how long it took the flaperon to be released from the plane debris.
What is clear is that this piece did not float in this configuration. Now, other configurations are possible, to be sure, but in this configuration, it did not float like this across the ocean in this configuration.
Unless when it got to the when it
Yeah.
expressed itself on the surface, it was in the configuration seen on when it landed,
Okay.
but somewhere along the way, it got involved with some fishing nets that pulled it down, permitted the lepus to colonize on top of that otherwise exposed surface
Yeah.
for a while, then got freed of the net and re-expressed itself with the exposed part.
But that would be not being in this configuration. That's what I'm saying. Like in this, it did not float like this. You're saying it could have floated differently, but it could not have floated like this, if that makes sense. There's no way. It just can't float exposed like this. It can't grow on in the open air.
Oh yeah, well yeah. It could float exposed, but wouldn't have Lepas on it.
Okay, so because it did have Lepas on it, we know that it didn't float in this configuration.
At some point, it was underwater. That's right. Now I can't say. I don't know that we can say when it was underwater. That's a really good question. How long?
Right.
If you're at sea for 15 months,
Right.
can you be partly exposed and partly underwater part of the time? Why would something that is usually above the water, the corner of the flaperon,
Right.
be underwater part of the time? It's got to be weighed down by something.
It's really interesting what Jim says. I think that you might sense that I was trying to get him to say it more clearly. He's a scientist. He doesn't like to say things like journalists like to say things like in headlines.
Yeah, that's not his thing.
It's not his thing. But what he's basically saying is that this piece could not have floated across the ocean with the, in this configuration, with the leading edge, the trailing edge sticking up. It just is physically impossible. Lepas do not grow in the air, so something must have been holding it down.
I like how you pointed out to me that scientists aren't really in the business of making pronunciations like this. But the other thing you said to me is that these individual guests and these individual experts aren't privy to all the information that is both in your head and published and what we've been speaking about for 20 episodes.
Right.
So he probably, when he doesn't have the spoof scenario in front of him, he doesn't have the SDU stuff, he just knows what he knows and can still show these irregularities that don't make sense. But this whole mystery, it really only becomes more clear when you look at the totality of it, as opposed to the individual weird scenario.
You look at the debris from MH370, the pieces that were collected were handed over to Australian scientists who looked at them carefully, and they found some really baffling patterns. Basically, none of the organisms that they found on these pieces matched what you would expect to see from a plane that had gone down 1.5 to 2 years before. Nothing was that old, and this mix of species wasn't right, especially on the piece that was collected by Blaine Allen Gibson in February of 2015, as we talked about in last episode. This had things living on it, but it had very few things that lived in the open ocean. And of the things that did live in the open ocean, none of them were more than 2 months old. And the only things that were a little bit older than that, there were 2 organisms that were like 8 months old, and these were things that only lived in coastal areas. They only live about 50 to 100 miles from the coast. So, knowing that this plane crashed in the remote Indian Ocean, which is nowhere near any land, how did it pick up these coastal species, and why didn't it pick up any of these open ocean species? So this is what I asked Jim next. So this piece washed ashore in July of 2015. It had been 15 months, and then some time passed and nothing else washed up. And people were starting to scratch their heads. And then a whole bunch of other pieces started to show up all at once.
Okay.
And in the final report that the ATSB put out in 2017, they actually talked in quite some detail about these things. And I think I've shared some of this with you in the past. So I wanted to talk about some of these things in terms of like what was on them and when they arrived.
So what were these other pieces? They were confirmed as part of the plane?
Yes, they all were confirmed. Some of them had serial numbers on them, and some of them just sort of matched the materials and the other. Like, okay, so the first piece that became publicly known was called No Step. It was a triangular piece it was a fragment of a horizontal stabilizer. And this was a really interesting piece because when it showed up, it didn't look like it had anything on it. Presumably, it had spent some time ashore, got picked clean, and then got re-washed out. But when they looked at it carefully, they found organisms kind of tucked into the nooks and crannies. It's an internal kind of honeycomb structure. It's very yummy for pieces to hide out and be happy.
Yep, that's very common. Yep.
Okay, so But it was interesting because when they looked at this, they found all the different species, they identified them, and two-thirds of them, I'm sort of reading from the reporter, two-thirds of the species, they only live close to shore and could not have been picked up in the open sea. And this is something I'd want to talk to you. So this is, I'm quoting here, the natural habitat of the recovered mollusks is shallow water on clean coral sand or in seagrass meadows. None of them could or would ever attach to drifting debris. So maybe we can talk about the difference between, what is it, benthic and pelagic is the term of art?
Yeah, I don't know how, if they wouldn't attach to the debris, how did they get on the debris?
Well, there was a question of,
Were they attached to the debris?
the only way the investigators could make sense of this was to assume that it had picked up the shells of these creatures from the sand, because these things, like their shells live in the sand or something. I mean, it's a mystery, frankly.
They're
And
either they're either attached or they're not. I mean,
okay,
you can have a piece of debris washing back and forth on a sandy beach, but the stuff in the sand is not going to cement itself onto the debris.
right. Okay. So this is a true mystery. And then one-third of the mollusks found on item 3 could plausibly have attached in the open water. But they were all juveniles of approximately 2 months old. And this is the thing I was emailing you earlier. Only 2 specimens from item 3, a sea snail of the species Petalococus rhinisectus,
Yes.
and a tube worm of the genus Vernaleopsis, okay,
Yes.
looked to be more than 2 months old. The former appears to be 6 to 8 months old, the latter 8 to 12 months old. And these, now this is where you can correct me. Both are usually found living on the seabed. Petalococus is only rarely found on floating debris, and Vermiliopsis never is, according to this, or according to someone I talked to. I can't remember. So how do you? Before we get too deep into it, Jim,
Yeah.
So some things live in the open ocean, and some things live like
On the coast.
on the coast or on the seabed or something.
Same thing.
Okay.
Same thing. Yeah, it's not really much of a mystery. If we take a plastic bucket and throw it into Long Island Sound,
Mm-hmm.
it's clean. It's from the terrestrial environment, and it floats long enough at the surface. The larvae of species that are in the water column will attach to the bucket.
Right.
There it is. Now, where are these larvae from? Some of them are from the seashore, the intertidal zone. Some of them could be benthic species that are living at 20, 30, 40 feet below um, on the floor of Long Island Sound, and they're looking to attach to a hard substrate.
Okay.
And the fact that it's a floating object, um, these larvae do not have generally a very high GPA, and so they're attaching to a solid substrate.
Anything.
Vermiliopsis is going to be a worm that's common in shallow waters,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's intertidal or shallow waters. It produces larvae. Those larvae swim around and they'll attach to stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, they attached to this part of the plane that was floating along. Where those larvae came from, we don't know what population of Vermiliopsis produced those larvae. Presumably, this is a species widespread through the Indian Ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a surprise. A ton of stuff can be found on rafting debris that has never previously been reported on rafting debris, but that's an artifact of how much stuff we've looked at, not an artifact of like, oh my gosh, what's this thing doing on a raft?
Right.
The larvae attached to it. There it is. Now, do the larvae of Vermiliopsis produced from the coastal zone or Petalococus, do they go 50 miles out at sea? Do they go 100 miles out to sea? Where are those little suckers floating around?
Mm.
In general, we don't often know that, how far out to sea. The general model is, if I'm talking to my students, if you are a shallow water species that lives along the seashore in 10 or 20 feet of water, and you have the misfortune of your larvae being picked up by an ocean current, and you're heading out to sea a few hundred miles, you're probably dead. Because what in the heck are you going to attach to out there? You're not a deep sea species. You're not going to sink down to the deep sea floor. You may find a piece of drift algae, but whatever. But in this case, it's your lucky day. You find some piece of marine debris to settle on. Now, how far? When did it acquire that marine debris? Unless we think the pieces of the plane actually floated along the coastline within a few 100 feet, the larvae obviously were acquired somewhere, I would guess, within miles of a shoreline. But who knows?
And this is where it gets puzzling because, as you said, for these, if these pieces are, let's say, 8 months old, then that means that 8 months ago, the piece must have been near some kind of shoreline, and that becomes problematic because if you're near the seventh arc, the nearest thing to the north is the Cocos Islands, and then if you go a little further west, you get Diego Garcia, and then there's nothing, literally nothing until Rodriguez, and it gets pretty problematic as to where this thing could have picked this stuff up.
Yeah, we would dream about having a GPS, a tracker on it, and how
Right.
if we had had a tracker, it would be like one of those cartoon characters in one of those Sunday cartoons where it's a little kid going like this from the playground to the candy
Yeah.
store, and a
Like the
big
Family Circus.
yes,
Nobody's going to remember that.
yes, yeah, thank you, exactly, Family Circus, where it shows the little kid
Yeah.
wandering all over. He's going from school to home,
Right.
and the route he describes, it's not a straight route, but he describes every possible path. In fact, in some cases, he goes back for a while and goes forward. So, I don't know how whoever did that. I don't know how they estimated the age of the worm
Right.
group or
Right.
the age of the snail. Probably knew what they were doing. I'm sure these are good folks down there. Um, but again, um, evidence over and over again suggests often a circuitous path.
But again, you need time to take a circuitous path. And I think if you're looking at the amount of time that elapsed before this thing got to Mozambique, where it
Yeah.
was discovered, it can't dither and dally too much. And it does, and also just the lack of any deep water species while you and at the same time you've got these shallow water species. It is
The,
puzzling, no?
the lack of deep water species may simply mean that the deep water larvae are not at the surface.
So just to clarify what Jim is saying, he's saying that in order for no step to have these organisms that are 8 months old and only live in close to the shore, the piece must have somehow been near a shore.
Yeah, and I'm
And
looking at this
yeah,
map, Jeff, and there just aren't any shores out there. This is
yeah.
like a giant, expansive piece of ocean.
Well, there's sort of on the
There are a
margins
couple.
a possibility. So if you look at this map, on the far right, there is a sort of the white tracks are really dense because that's where they all start. This is from the simulations that the Australians did. And you're seeing these pieces start in a very tight cluster and basically get carried by the currents first to the northeast and then north and then curving around to the west. And those two green circles are 100-mile circles around Cocos Island and Diego Garcia. And so that's about how close you have to get to these bodies of land to pick up these coastal species. And you can see that like there are a few of them just barely kind of go in that area. It's possible, but it's not that likely. And then they kind of get carried swiftly westward. It seems less likely that you're going to hit Diego Garcia. And then those yellow circles, the easternmost one is Rodriguez, the middle one is La Reunion, and the westernmost one is Vilanculos, where no step came from.
I've never heard of the Cocos Islands. I have heard of Diego Garcia. And once again, that is one of those places that the conspiracy theorists kind of latch
Yeah,
into.
we probably have talked about it enough already. But the point just being that it's not impossible to come up with a story for how this piece got these weird species on it, but it kind of requires everything to line up perfectly, and it leaves a lot of unanswered questions, like how come it doesn't have any Lepas? I mean, maybe they got chewed up and eaten off because clearly this piece is doesn't have the kind of rich array of life on it. It probably has spent some time ashore. So that might not be the best example, but it's a little bit weird.
Yeah, and then so this is the next thing you asked Jim about was what I mentioned earlier, this
Right,
Mossel Bay piece, the Roy piece.
right,
It washed ashore at the southern tip of South Africa not long after the flaperon.
right, right. So it's only a few months after Flaperon. One of the mysteries of Mossel Bay is how did it get that far in that short amount of time? And so this is something that we talked to Jim about. There was a piece that washed ashore. This is one of the really puzzling pieces. It has a whole weird story. It was found in Mossel Bay.
Yeah.
And when
Yeah.
the Australian authorities who did the drift modeling for the flaperon, they spent a lot of time trying to figure out the flaperon drift modeling, and they finally made it make sense. But then when they looked at the Mossel Bay, we have no idea how this got this far. It's at the southern tip of South Africa.
I know where it is. Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and the other weird thing about it was discovered, or it was, yeah, it was found in like a February or March of 2016. But then once somebody went, there was a local newspaper stories about it, and another local person said, "Oh, I saw that 3 months ago, and I took a picture of it." And so they came forward, and so it must have like so this is a perfect example of how a thing can wash ashore full of all kinds of yummy, juicy, fleshy marine life.
Yeah.
And then it gets kind of washed out. It gets maybe got taken up the river. Some muskrats chewed on it or what have you, meerkats, I don't know. And then it gets washed back out, gets washed back in, and then it winds up pretty much in the same place that it started 3 months ago, just like this family circus, and it's been stripped clean. But because this picture existed, there's actually, you can see a very healthy population of lepus. Again, I did my kind of rough and ready image analysis, and it looks like these things are about 2.5 centimeters long in the
Yeah.
capitulum, which again is actually about the same size as I did image analysis on the flaperon, and I came to about 2.5 centimeters. When the French had it, this is another mystery. You and I have discussed this as well. The French, if you look at pictures, to me it looks like they're about 2.5 centimeters. The French took it to Toulouse. They said, "Oh no, they're up to 3.6." But of course, you need to find the 3.6 one. You need to look all over to find the
Yeah.
best ones, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The ones that they turned over for a chemical analysis, which is a whole nother story I'm not even going to get into right now.
Yeah.
But the ones they turned over were like 2.5 centimeters. So maybe if you do image analysis and it looks like 2.5, maybe they get up to 3.6. You're just missing it. But the point was they seem to be of a similar kind of age population, but none of them match 15 months of going in the water.
Yeah. Yeah. Earlier generations can come and go. So if they had 36 centimeter or nearly 40 centimeter lepas, those were probably the ones that first settled.
Right.
Those are gone for some reason. Fish got them, and then what we saw was a second or third generation of lepas,
I
possibly.
mean, I've been talking to other people who specialize in lepus, and they seem to be of the opinion that for a piece to have a lepus population and then lose it entirely is not really something you expect to see in the open ocean per se. It has more to maybe if it gets ashore, lepus are incredibly vulnerable. They get picked clean really fast.
Yes.
But in the open ocean, there are predators who specialize in lepus,
Yes.
but they'll take out individuals. They
Unless
won't wipe out
right, unless the object flips over.
unless the object flips over.
And then
But so, one of the things that scientists have to deal with as they're trying to make sense of the world is ideas like evidence that's consistent with
yeah,
a conclusion or evidence that proves a conclusion.
right.
And there's nothing that really proves. I mean, and I want to keep talking about some other pieces, but there's nothing we haven't come across anything so far that proves that this piece went into the water where we think it went into the water. We haven't even found evidence that's consistent with it going into the water when and where we think it did. And there's nothing that's consistent. There's nothing that proves that it didn't, but there's nothing that's consistent with that either.
We certainly know it was floating. We know that. There's no question about that because it has Lepas on it.
Right.
Lepas don't lie.
So again, this problem that we keep on hammering on about, which is that you would expect all of these pieces should have marine life on it that is 15 months to 2 years old, depending on which piece being found when. And that's not what we find. In fact, none of these pieces have anything older than 8 months old. None of the oceanic species are more than a couple months old. And so taken together, the totality of the evidence looked at together is even more puzzling than any one of the pieces looked at individually.
I mean, even that piece on Rodriguez Island, the biggest barnacle there was only 20 millimeters, which means it's not any older than 105 days.
Right.
What does Jim have to say
And so,
about
I mean,
this?
you can imagine that it's not hard at all to imagine a piece washing ashore and getting eaten clean. We saw it with the Mossel Bay piece. But all of them, and this happened to, and then they washed out to shore and spent months back at sea. It's the pattern is a little baffling. But this is, and I asked Jim about this. Now, Jim, you looked at Japanese tsunami debris, and we posed the kind of philosophical question earlier of like, if you didn't know that there had been a tsunami in Japan in 2011, you might not have known that. But if someone came to you, say you'd been collecting all this debris, and someone had said, "Hey, I've got an idea. I'm going to hypothesize that there was a tsunami in Japan in 2011. Has the debris that you've collected consistent with that? Are you seeing evidence that would be consistent, like the age of the barnacles, the species? Would you say that there's stuff on these debris that would disprove what I'm saying, or at least isn't not that it would disprove it, but that at least is consistent with that?"
Sure. I mean, if we had something raft in and land in California, and it had on it a species only known from Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
um, there was some event in Vietnam
Mm-hmm.
that sent that to sea. We know the
Right.
source. We could look at what's on. We could look at that organism, and we can say, can we? We've established it's a Vietnamese species. How old is it? Would be the next question.
Right.
We might say, it could be 5 years or older.
Okay.
It could be no more than 1 year old.
Right.
Things like that, and
Yeah.
that's how we would back into the story.
Right.
Absolutely, and that's mostly what we do with debris. The March 11, 2011 event was extremely rare.
Right.
Here was an episode where we knew both the time and date of inoculation into the ocean.
Right.
But mostly, when I find stuff washed ashore, and I've been on beaches all over the world looking for cool marine debris with stuff on it,
Right.
I generally, I have to guess, if they are local species, we can go to Hawaii
Mm-hmm.
and find Hawaiian species on marine debris.
Right.
So this stuff went into the ocean in Hawaii and floated around and landed back on a beach.
Yeah.
Other stuff, it's just a guess. Where were you? How long have you been out there? And that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
it's rare when we have such a luxury of knowing exactly when and where an object could have gone in the ocean, like pieces of this plane.
I mean, I guess sort of what I'm trying to ponder about is this idea that we have a population of articles that we know came from the plane. Some of them we strongly suspect, and some of them we just know outright. And yet, of this population of objects, none of them has any evidence that is consistent with an impact in the search area at the time that the crash presumably occurred. And I think that's remarkable, actually. And I think it's worth noting how unusual that is.
And you're basing that on the age of the age of the
The
Lepas?
age of the Lepas, I mean, again, there's unknowns. We don't know. Obviously, it's like entirely possible that these things, because of the water temperature and the nutrient density,
Yeah.
that they all just grew much more slowly, even than pieces that were known to have crossed the ocean around the same time. And listen, there's there's innocent explanations for things, but I think it's worth noting that there is an apparent discrepancy that's worth
So,
drawing a
so,
line under.
so Jeff, if those 36 millimeter Lepas, those could those could put the impact, the place, the guesstimated impact site. Um, in theory, those could put it back at the search area.
There seems to be some controversy about that, but I mean,
How old is that 36 millimeter sucker? You
well, and
know?
again, and this is you've have pointed out the annoyingness of this. That wasn't your word, but it's like the French have this very crucial piece of evidence, and all they're showing us is the 2.5s.
Yeah.
Why are they keeping? I actually just got friended on LinkedIn with a guy who has inspected this piece. He works for
Yeah.
the French media agency, so maybe I'll find an answer. I'm going to try, but it's a lot more puzzling than an event that's so well defined and so understood. Like with the tsunami event, all the pieces line up.
Yes.
There's pieces that are outliers,
Yes.
but the mass of the data conforms with what's known. In this case, it doesn't seem to be so clean cut. I want to thank Jim Carlton again for his taking the time. He is the leading expert on marine invertebrates, so I'm really grateful to him. But taken all together, what it means is that it just doesn't look like these pieces floated from the search zone in the seventh arc. There's nothing about these pieces that indicates or would suggest that that's the case. And obviously, given that I also believe that there's spoof scenarios possible, you have to ask yourself, is the totality of this debris evidence that the plane crashed in the southern Indian Ocean, or rather is it evidence that it didn't crash in the southern Indian Ocean?
Yeah, and more specifically, the fact that neither any of the authorities nor the media has drawn any attention to this, it's kind of baffling to me. But just as a person who is listening to these interviews and has been following this, the question is, did somebody drop this debris and let it show up where it showed up and it didn't actually float there?
Yeah. I mean, I think what we're hearing again and again, and we talk to marine biologists, like even to suggest that like this stuff might have been planted is kind of anathema. I mean, it starts to sound like conspiracy theories, but like the idea of putting a piece of something in the water and letting it stew for a couple months and then putting it on a shore is not challenging technically. It takes a little work. It doesn't really take any brain power. In fact, if this was planted, it wasn't planted with a lot of brain power because it doesn't seem like a lot of effort was made to create pieces whose marine life is really very convincing. But people don't want to be on the conspiracy train. And so what we have in front of us is if we want to really make a case that this stuff is weird, we're going to have to talk to a lot of marine biologists, try to get a lot of opinions, and I can't make someone say, "Oh, this piece couldn't have floated in this configuration," but I can get them to say that like it would have to have been held down by something, which is essentially the same. He doesn't know. So basically, to recap what Jim said, this piece could not have floated the way that the Australians assume, based all their drift modeling on. It must have been attached to something else. It was held underwater, whether by accident or by design. It was held underwater, and that is not something that anybody really has grappled with. And frankly, the ATSB has just not dealt with it at all.
Okay, so as we wrap up episode 20, this one was a doozy. Many of them are doozies, but they're becoming more so because
they're going to get doozier. And Andy, wait, I want to tell you one more thing.
Okay.
This is stuff you will not hear anywhere else.
It certainly doesn't seem like it.
We are doing reporting that no one else is doing. And I think other people should be doing it, but they're not. And anybody can look. Go find your own marine biologist, show him pictures of the flaperon, ask him, do Lepas like to grow sticking a foot out of the water, and ask them what they think. But it's a mystery. You might have it. If you have another explanation, put it in the comments. I want to hear about it.